don't think you should be clapping yet. Unless you're clapping Chris, of course, which is fine. So what a lovely building to be in. This building is lovely. What was it originally, this building? Unitarian. Congregation. Unitarian, right, yeah, okay. Just a little bit about who I am and what FWAG is to begin with. So I've worked for this organisation in Somerset for 33 years, so it's been my main life's work, really. FWAG stands for Farming and Wildlife Advisory Group. It's a charity, it's an NGO, and works with other organisations in Somerset, but the key thing about FWAG is that farming is first. So farming, the clue is in the name really, it's advice. It combines farming and wildlife, or the wider environment these days really. And it kind of started in the late 1970s when we realised in post-war kind of food security policies that we were just like giving grants to destroy habitat, drain fields, all in the name of production, because we'd just come out of a war where we realised we needed to feed ourselves, a very different day. Not that long ago really, and we realised, some farmers started to realise in the 1970s what was happening. And then later, obviously, science and monitoring caught up with that, and wanted to invent an organisation that could sit between an environmentalist, which in the 1980s were kind of, well, they all wore sandals, they all had long hair, they all had multicoloured jumpers. So the contrast between the farming sector and an environmental sector was just so far apart. So an organisation that was farming-led that could bring them together, and that's where FWAG came from. We're in a different day now, I remember when I started, the environment was not mainstream in farming, in terms of farming policy and in terms of government policy. The environment is now mainstream. So any subsidy now coming to farming increasingly has an environmental slant. When I started, it had no environmental slant. So we've moved a long, long way. Anyway, I'm not just here to talk about that tonight. I'm here to talk really what has happened in terms of my role and my work since the 13-14 flood event. And the reason I've got the Somerset Rivers Authority logo up there is that I've worked very closely with the Rivers Authority, which, whether you like it or not, you all pay towards through your council tax. There is a shadow precept to help support that, which is unique. No other county in England has it. And that was in a direct response to be able to fund works that nationally could not be justified. The county kind of negotiated with the government at the time permission to be able to raise a shadow precept that wouldn't be affected by caps on council tax, specifically to spend on flood mitigation work that's unique to Somerset, that wouldn't be justified through cost-benefit analysis at a national level. Okay, so, and that raises about 3 million a year, which can be spent on various initiatives locally. Not great big initiatives like the Bridgewater Barrier, for example. That will have to be funded nationally, but more local initiatives that wouldn't be funded that way. Right, so here back to not that long ago, 10 years ago, well actually technically speaking just short of 11 years ago, around about December 2013 to March 2014, mid-December to mid-March, there were only 2 days that had no rainfall at all during that period, somewhere in the catchment. Okay, now you can do what you want with that information, but it wasn't so much the amount of rainfall that was the problem, it's the fact that it just kept on coming. There was no break in it, really, and that was why it just built up and up and up. And you had these ridiculous scenes, and it hit the headlines. Somerset, I think Somerset was more famous internationally during that period. Even people in the far-flung parts of the world who we were speaking to were saying, "Oh, are you all right? You know, are you surviving? Well, what, you know, but we're on the hill, it's okay." But there were all sorts of funny slides that were going around at the time, which were causing, everyone found a funny side. and some people really got to enjoy it and find other ways of using the water. But what happened really was that we needed to do a little bit of a rethink about, okay, we can't go on, it's going to get worse, we know it's going to get worse, and what can we do over the next 20 years, halfway through, to change things? One of those was a local funding mechanism, so the Somerset Rivers Authority that I mentioned, that was one of the recommendations. There were others, but the scale and the duration of the flood event, really, it was, I mean, I was in kind of local government circles, local versions of national government bodies like the Environment Agency and Natural England and all the councils, and it really was, everyone, business as usual stopped, and everyone who was any good was on this crisis, and not just managing the crisis, but also where we go from here. So the 20-year plan was drafted, which was a little bit of a wish list of what we think we'd like to do. Now, obviously, the immediate cry was we need to increase the capacity of the carriers which move water out of the floodplain and out to sea. And some of those carriers, like the River Thorne, the River Parrett, had been unmanaged, rightly or wrongly, for many, many years, partly because you just couldn't justify spending the money. The benefit of doing it didn't really match, according to government calculations, the cost of doing it. But when the Prime Minister gets involved and says, this will never happen again, here's 10 million, just go and dredge the most important stretch. It just happened like that. And that's the great thing about a crisis or a war, and it was war footing for Somerset. You make decisions in war footings that you don't make other times, rightly or wrongly. But what we've begun to think about during that time, particularly us as an organisation and some others, is surely it's time to join it up. Surely it's time to think about the catchment, bearing in mind the blue area, which is the floodplain of the Somerset levels, is only 22% of the catchment area. And it doesn't take a genius to work out that the rest of the catchment has a contribution towards the floodplain, and therefore we need to think about the whole of the catchment rather than just the part that catches the headlines and is in the news, which it was, and it's very newsworthy, but there are lots of other areas we need to be looking about. So we came up with this kind of term, hills to levels, not so much as a project, but more just as a kind of working concept. This is how we want to change the way, and other people call it integrated catchment management. It's now, remember this was 10, 11 years ago, and it was newer then, and now everyone says, well, of course, it's obvious, isn't it? But it wasn't obvious then. And that's why, so the temptation was, the focus always, everyone knows what about the levels? What about the levels? And we say, yes, the levels, but what about the rest of the catchment? What about the Isle? What about the Yeo? What about all these hill areas exactly where we're sitting tonight? They have a part to play. And it's really brought into the sharpest focus when you look at this, which is part of Hay Currymore, just, if you, not quite your area, but everyone know where Currymore is, just kind of north of North Curry. That soil, well, the colour of that water does not relate to the soil around it. Yes? That's where it comes from. That's Wiveliscombe, which is the other side of Taunton. So that water has come off about 12 miles away, down the Thorne, through tributaries, all the way through Taunton. It's hit a spillway somewhere just on the road, well, somewhere near North Curry, should I say. Hit the spillway, and there it has to be slowed down some. We speed it up through Taunton, get out of Taunton as quickly as we can. We've got to slow it down somewhere. Help, we'll slow it down. Have a spillway, Currymore, dump it on Currymore, but it's red. So we started to hang on a minute. There's a relationship here, and you might say, of course, it's obvious, but it isn't. You have to make it blindingly obvious to change policy sometimes and change ways of thinking. And we realised that we needed to do something about this. These sorts of things, thankfully, are not happening now. But the chap who's standing there, he's actually, he's an academic from, I can't remember which university, and he was down to look at this. I thought those kind of gullies, which by the way happened overnight, only happened in sub-Saharan Africa, where I have seen them like that. And some of you may have been there and seen gullies like that, where you have extraordinary rainfall events and quite vulnerable soils. Well, we have very vulnerable soils in the Thorne catchment. They're just very deep, so we don't worry about it. Because, as some farmers say to me, you can bury a horse and its rider standing up in some of those soils. They're so deep, so you don't mind losing a bit. But that's another story. But the other picture that you can see, not with the guy standing, that's actually a road in the foreground and a field in the background. And if you look very carefully, I don't know if you'll be able to see, I'll try and point it out. That is a potato. That's a field of potatoes, and so that's a road, potatoes in the road. And so this sort of thing, you know, we've got to say, well, hang on a minute, surely we've got to do something about this if we're going to solve the problem further down, where once the water is in the system, we can't get rid of it. We've got gravity on our side here. How can we use gravity rather than relying on floodplains where it gets stuck and you have to pump it out? So, we came up with all sorts of new approaches, which again now are being taken up nationally and all over the place. These are just all sorts of different terms for basically the same thing. And they are just, you might have seen or heard of these kind of terminology. They all mean the same thing. It's just thinking a little differently rather than traditional, conventional engineering solutions right next to where the flood happens. It's slowing the flow, tackling it further upstream where you can. And the principle behind this, again, it doesn't take a genius to work it out. So this is a classic flood hydrograph that you'll all be sorry about. The slide didn't work. That's Windows to Apple, I'm afraid, didn't work, didn't like that. So that's your conventional flood hydrograph. So all you're trying to do, really, by slowing down the flow, is you're trying to buy some time. You're trying to, what we call, flatten off the flood hydrograph. And by buying time, you allow the system to be able to cope with the volumes of water better. And so what we're doing with these natural approaches, NFM stands for Natural Flood Management, really we're just trying to buy time. In places we're looking to store water, but generally we're trying to slow the whole system down so the rivers and the carriers within the system can cope, and they're not overwhelmed by huge amounts of water all coming at once. Now, the one challenge we've got with natural flood management is when you're dealing with huge volumes of water, like millions of cubic meters of water, which is what we had during that big flood event 11 years ago. They were ridiculous volumes of water. You can't deal with those kinds of volumes easily up in the hills. You need huge reservoirs. You know, you need reservoirs the size of, I don't know, Ilminster to be able to cope. You need huge reservoirs everywhere, which we're not going to have because we've got people living there and the land's too valuable. So what we found is that natural flood management is not brilliant at helping stop very, very large floods. But what it is brilliant at is helping stop flooding at a local level. And the reason I put this slide up is you can see some of these places. I just picked off a few. Within the last 18 months, that I'm aware of, there are all sorts of other villages that aren't on here, they're probably in the last 2 years, these are local flood events that have happened not through the river flooding, but through what I will call pluvial events, rainfall events, not through fluvial events, which is when the river fills up, overtops into a floodplain. Okay, there is some flooding here, but most of this is runoff driven. Do you understand the difference between the two? It's important. The distinction is really important because it is these runoff type of events that are getting more common because the rainfall pattern is more unpredictable. And this is, say, in the last 2 years. And I mean, Withycombe, that's a village. Cam Valley, that's a whole set of villages that had problems. Ilminster, you know about the problems here. And they're sometimes linked to urban issues and to culverts and the infrastructure, drainage infrastructure, but usually it's just more rain than the system can cope with within that period of time. And it's not going to go away. And the challenge we've got with it is that I can show you this slide in a year's time and all the red areas will be completely different. We can't predict where it's going to happen. So it might happen in Merriott, and then next year it might happen in Overstratton, because I know someone who's from Overstratton here. And it's really, really difficult, and we can't invest millions of pounds on flood infrastructure for an event that might happen somewhere over the next 5 years, 10 years. Now, we don't mind protecting 10,000 homes and spending millions of pounds doing that. It's worth it. We can prove a clear cost and benefit. But this is the challenge. These pluvial events that cause an equal amount of damage, if it gets wet, it's wet, right? Whether it's wet through a floodplain or wet through water coming down the street, running through your house out the other side, it's wet, it's damage. So this is the challenge we've got. It is these local flooding events that are the most concerning. And they actually affect far, far more homes than any of them. On the levels, 2013-14, it was less than 200 houses were affected. Well, I can tell you, in the Cam Valley, May 2022, there were, over that number of houses affected. Not flooded up to this level for 3 months, admittedly, but they got wet. And so the pictures will go to the levels because of the depth and the duration. In terms of homes, it's all in the upper catchment. There's more homes, more people. You can't build a home on levels, it's too wet. It's flat, it's a floodplain. It's off the floodplains increasingly where the challenges are. So why has a town like Ilminster got a flooding issue when most of it's off the floodplain? Why? Because of pluvial events, storm events, which are getting more common, unpredictable. So we believe that natural flood management can really help with that. It can help with the big water down the bottom of the system, but particularly further up it can help. So how? So the first thing that we try and do is we do something called flow pathway mapping. And all we're doing really is we're using a computer to, there you go, there's the computer, and we mimic pouring a bucket of water, a watering can on a catchment, and the computer will tell us where the water should go. And it's usually pretty accurate, actually. And then what you can do is then you can, what we call ground truth, you can say, is that really where the water goes? Or you can talk to the farmer and say, when it rains, where does the water run? And you can usually see it, or he'll say, oh yeah, that is about right. The computer is about right. The computer just follows contours. It follows preferential pathways where water should go. And then what we try and do is, from that, we try and then interrupt these pathways, as I'll come on to. So, catchment management or natural flood management then, so in terms of the approaches, we tend to use 3 different main strands. Number 1 is we've got to get the soil working better, and I'll come on to that in a minute. Number 2, we want to try and divert those pathways of water to stop them causing problems, slow them down, divert them away from housing, from sensitive vulnerable areas. And then finally, we want to actually slow the water once it gets into watercourses or into floodplain areas. So those are the 3 main strands, okay? So get the soils working better, slow down the runoff, the surface runoff, and once it gets into channels, carriers, then how can we slow it down in those? Those are the 3 main strands. So then look at soils first. Right. Here's a brilliant picture that shows you the difference between a soil that's working well and a soil that isn't. And if you see a soil from this time through the winter and it's shiny, a field that's shiny, you know there's a problem. It shouldn't be shiny, especially the soils around here. These soils have a high storage capacity. If those soils are in good condition, it should be, well, they won't be brown, they won't be black, they'll be browner here with these types of kind of Yeovil sands, derivative soils. You might find a clay soil in a floodplain that will be a bit shiny because it's naturally impermeable. But we can tell from that field at the top, there's a problem. They're the same soil type as the field in the foreground or further up the hill, but there is a problem. There is something impeding the percolation of that water into that soil. And that is compaction. And we've been able to find out from soil survey, getting experts in, just how serious this problem is for different crops on different soil types. Got some figures here, and we found, this is 10 years ago, we found that 30% of the soils in the Thorne and Parrot catchment have high water storage capacity. So they can do a really brilliant job at storing water, holding it, and releasing it in the summer when we have drought periods as well. But we found that 55% of cultivated fields were degraded by compaction. Therefore, they were suboptimal in terms of their ability to receive water, drain water, or hold water. And crucially, under certain crops, that was as high as 80 or 90% of those soils were degraded, which tells us that certain crops are definitely going to cause enhanced local flooding. Not because of the crop, but because of what it means to the soil. It means that soil will shed water, not receive water. Whereas under permanent grassland, some permanent grassland, the level of degradation is less than 10%. So that, I'm not saying we should put everything into grassland, I'm not saying that at all. I'm just saying some of these high-value crops on some of these high-value soils cause us major problems. Okay, so that's a map. We also looked at where are the soils that have the highest storage capacity, because we're going to talk to farmers. We want to concentrate on those soils that we know have the greatest ability naturally to help. There's no point in trying to work necessarily with clay soils. Clay soils, when it gets wet, they stay wet until it gets dry, right? You know that if you have a garden with clay. Soils that have a higher sand content or even some silt content can help us because they have the ability to be able to store water between the particles. They just have a higher particle size. But this sort of thing is something that you will be aware of in this area, I know, and I'm going to show Mike's something he sent to me in a minute. But this is actually just around the corner from the office in Wellington where I was based at the time. And it highlights one of the problem crops for us, which is a brilliant crop for lots and lots of reasons. Maize is about the most efficient crop for converting sun's energy into something we can use for food or for energy generation. It's very efficient. But a problem is we are right on the edge of the range of growing maize. If you grow it in eastern England, it's fine because you have hotter summers, the crop matures earlier. You tend to have drier autumns. So if you go south or east from here, you don't find this crop in Scotland. You don't find it in Northern Ireland. You don't find it in Northern England much unless you put it under plastic. We're on the edge of the range. And that means it's tricky. It means that the problem may be that we're harvesting this crop in wet conditions too late in the season. How many of you know what happens when you walk on soil, drive on soil when it's wet? You knacker it. You squash it. You stop it storing and make it function like a car park. Oh, what have I done? Try that. Mike sent me this. This was I think a Soil Association report about 10 years ago, something like that, Mike? Something like that. And I mean, there's a report behind it, but it just... I mean, I don't want to get political here, but I do, really. One of the challenges we've got with maize is, and I say it because of where we are geographically, I'm very aware of the amount of maize that's grown in this area. And a lot of it, we know what it's grown for. It's grown for energy generation. It's grown for a biogas plant, for producing methane, to put that methane into the grid, to replace natural gas, which is brilliant, green energy, right? And it's subsidised because we want to subsidise green energy to encourage it to take up market share. But what we're not realising, the associated costs with that green energy, soil on the road, possibly people's homes, certainly danger to traffic. There are costs that are being incurred, and this is what happens with government policy. You go for something, you seem to make sense, but it has consequences you don't realise until a few years on. And this is the reason that Mike was writing a letter to the MP, just to kind of keep this before a new MP, to realise this unjoined up. So our council tax is under pressure because we've got lots and lots of these sorts of situations on roads to sort out. On the other hand, it's being produced partly by crops that are being subsidised also by us, the taxpayer. So, anyway, you see my challenge with it. This is what a degraded, compacted soil looks like. This is within, actually not far away from here, I won't say exactly where. But look at that, so it doesn't look happy, does it? I mean, you don't have to be a soil expert, a soil scientist to say that doesn't look happy. It looks wrong, it looks cold, heavy, anaerobic, smelly, and not nice, right? There's no air, there's no oxygen, there's no life, there's no biological activity, it's dead. Right? That's the classic compacted soil, and water won't go through that. That's an example of a more healthy soil, and you can see the crop that it was dug from. There's the ground that was dug from, nothing growing. There's the crop that was dug from. You can see, it feels lighter, doesn't it? Yeah, no, I mean, it smells different. Okay, it's a different soil type, admittedly, but that's because there's space, there's roots, there's air, there's movement of water. There's some room for water to move down through it to drain. So what we did is that we've had a couple of experts working with farmers to help them understand compaction doesn't just affect their crop yields, compaction affects everything, but especially the people who live in proximity to those soils. So we realised pretty early on that soils are like the sleeping giant of green engineering, really. If we can get our soils working really, really well, which we are doing better than we were 10 years ago, then we can solve a lot of problems. And it's not just nasty crops like maize and potatoes. I don't mean it. Maize is a brilliant crop, it just has to be grown right. It can also happen on grassland. So we actually looked at some grassland, lay grassland under dairy farming that can be very compacted. Silage can be made in the spring, when the soils can still be quite wet, heavy trailers can cause major compaction. So we even found that just by lifting the compaction in grassland, which is what you can see in that picture, we can improve infiltration. Okay, so that's soils. Then what about diverting and attenuating flows? So what we did, again, this is some of you might even recognise that, pretty close to Ilminster. What we did early on was we were able to, with farmers who were keen and willing to work with us, we were able to use those pathways, to look at those pathways and then interrupt along that pathway at critical points where we could hold back soil, hold back water, slow it down. So obviously we're trying to work with the soil first. Second, let's say rainfall overwhelms the ability of the soil to drain it, which it will sometimes. What can we do about the runoff to stop it hitting a road or a river or even a house? And here's other things that we tried. We tried lots and lots of these, particularly actually in the Thorne catchment, but some also in the Parrot catchment. We tried things that we called leaky ponds. And all they are really is that we find a pathway, and if there's room on that pathway, we dig a hole. We have a leaky device, which is basically just a hole in the ground with a draining structure, so that what will happen, that draining structure will just drain the water out of the pond slower than it comes into the pond. They're not permanent ponds. We might have a permanent kind of base level to give it some ecological benefit, but by and large they are temporary ponds to hold water for a temporary period while that pathway is running. When the pathway stops, it'll drain down to a base level and it'll be ready for the next time it rains hard. So we found these were really simple, and farmers are quite keen to do them because they like ponds. There you go, that's the principle behind it. That's the That's the permanent water level that will have ecological benefit, but that's a big, what we call freeboard, and that area in there is our flood storage kind of area. But it may only hold for 24 hours, 48 hours. And this is the basic bit of drainage pipe turned upside down. And we would just cut the outflow, we would cut a different size depending on how much was coming in. We had to, sometimes a bit of trial and error to try and get the outflow right. But all sorts of other things. I just want to show you this as well. So here's a pathway. This is the Hill Farrants Brook, which is a tributary of the River Thorne. And what we'd identify is, okay, here's a hedgerow. Is it an existing hedgerow? Can we do something with that hedgerow to try and interrupt that pathway? Yes, we can. Here we are, this is what it looks like. Actually, that's where the pathway started. That's the Hill Farrants Brook down the bottom. And see that bit of soil there? All we're doing is reinforcing that hedge bank, using an existing natural feature to try and hold back that water, interrupt the pathway. And hopefully, because we found that the pathways, partly the problem is momentum. So if we can interrupt the flow and slow it down, the water will soak in. But if you've got water starting here, running all the way down there, it builds up a head of steam. If you can slow it down, it's more likely to drain away or dissipate rather than carry on down through the valley. Here's another example, something we tried, just that's a little bit more extreme because you're into an arable crop, but just putting soil buns or banks, just again to interrupt. But you get the drift of what we're trying to do, just to interrupt these pathways. Obviously, tree planting, we've used tree planting in places, not huge volumes of tree planting because around this area particularly we've got potentially some very good land and we want to grow food on that land. We need food. We want to cover it all in trees. But what we found was it wasn't so much about the amount of trees, it was where they were. So it's strategic tree planting, getting it in the right place, i.e. that's the direction of flow. Some of you might even reckon this is very near here. This is runoff, direction of flow. This is quite flat on top, arable fields. It runs off here, down this slope. There's a tributary of the Isle. And so by putting those trees at the top of the slope, the landowner was quite keen to do it. Ideally, we would like the whole field, the whole of it, but that was not so steep. This was too steep for doing anything useful in his mind. So happy. So it was a bit of a bargaining going on here. Here's another example. This is the River Thorne catchment. There's the A358 that runs between Taunton and Willerton on the way to Minehead. Soil and water used to pour off this field because of the crops that were being growing on that good soil. And we just said that was just 1 hectare, 2.5 acres that just planted out. Farmer was happy to do it, solved the problem within 2 years. So trees in the right location can have a major benefit. Also, planting hedges. Again, not planting hedges everywhere. Farmers didn't want to do that, but it's planting hedges in the right place. It's using that pathway mapping. If we're going to plant a hedge here, where is the most important place to do it? This is a village called Holywell Lake, just up the hill a little bit from Wellington, not far from where I live. And we just worked with the bank. There was sort of a bank there, but it got broken down and eroded and filled in, and all some rabbits had to go, and probably badgers as well. And what we did, we just built up the bank by about 3 feet and planted a hedge on top of it. And what used to happen is that soil and water used to end up, I keep getting confused with used to end up just pouring down and collecting here. And then before the bank was there, where did it go? Into the village. Straight down the road into the village. So, farmer was happy, did that, cost a few £100, sorted it overnight. So we found it wasn't so much what you do, it's where you do it. And that's where the pathway mapping really helped us. Rights of way. Sometimes we had real issues on the Clontarf Hills, rights of way, and just all sorts of things that you can do with tracks and just all sorts of, attenuation, deflector, this is what we call a cross drain on a cow track, all sorts of things that you can do. So the third category, so one was soils, the next one is diverting those surface pathways, and the third thing was once the water gets into the ditch, river, channel, whatever, what can we do then? And all sorts of funky things. One of which you may have heard about, which is called woody debris dams, or leaky dams, or woody dams, which only really work in the very small streams. We found to our cost not to do these in rivers that have any energy, because they wash away, or the stream just finds a route round them very quickly. But what I wanted to kind of point out to you was, this is newly, so it looks like it, just two logs anchored to the side, quite long, so they won't move, not interrupting flow, what we call base flow. So when the river's running normally, won't interrupt any invertebrate activity, fish movement, won't interrupt anything along those lines. But when the level comes up, this is 1 to October, that's February. This is what they do, they trap other material. And if you have a succession of these on a small stream, it works really, really well. You know what I mean by Wind Whistle Ridge, right? Wind Whistle. Those woodlands on Wind Whistle Ridge, this works brilliantly. Steeper slopes, little streams, in woods, lots of material, it just slows, and you have a whole cascade of these, and they work really, really well. I mean, you have them naturally to an extent anyway, when a tree falls over, but it's just kind of working with nature a bit more. Here we go. We kind of, we did some monitoring and logged these a bit, and this is downstream of our woody dam, and that is upstream of our woody dam, all right? During a rainfall event. So the gap between the dark blue line and the light blue line is what we call storage. That's what we've stored from that little lump of wood. Not very much, but you have lots of them on small streams, it can play a part. That's what we found. So we found a place for those woody dams. Hopefully I'll play this and I'll just show you. This is just a time-lapse photography of a woody dam and just shows you how they work. Okay, I'll play it again. You might think, oh, no, I won't. I'll go back. I'll go forward and try and play it again. So they just fill up and drain down again. And all that is doing, it's buying time. It's reducing the discharge of that water on down the system. It's just, it's a nice bit of slowing the flow through a little bit of basic storage. So we also found with floodplains, we found an increasing problem with what we call floodplain misconnection or no connection with floodplains. And here's an example, there's a river, and if you have a look, this is not in this area, it's the other side of Taunton, but there's the river, there's the land up there and up there. Now that's woodland either side. And what we'd dearly love to be able to do is when the level of this river comes up, we'd like to be able to connect this river with the land around it, if it's suitable type of land. And all that will do is that will cause or bring those floodplains higher up the catchment into play, particularly areas of woodland or permanent grassland that won't matter if they're flooded a bit. And so what we tried to do was what we call floodplain reconnection. Here's an example. This is not too far away, this is near a crew cone. And so we found that this channel here, where the trees are, was what we call very incised. It was like, you go and look at it and the water's down there. It's been eroded over many, many, many years, and the river and its floodplain have lost touch with each other. So all we're trying to do is just break that steep bank simply, and we had to get the right consent, so we had to do this and do a bit of modelling to make sure we're not making things worse. And then we're creating something that we call backwaters. Now, if you ever watched a river in flood, you'll see it. It'll kind of pop onto the floodplain in places, and you'll find the river will be flowing that way, and there'll be a low point, and it'll kind of backfill. Are you following me? Yeah, there'll be a low point. If you walk along a floodplain, you'll see places that lie wet after it's been flooded. Why is that really wet? Well, that's because when the river came out, it went in there and it'll stay there. So you're just creating little backwater areas by reconnecting, just taking a little scoop out of the bank. That's all you're doing, really. Very, very simple. Has to be done right in the right areas. Because what we're finding is that, here's a stretch. This is Marriott. Well, that's another story. Why did I put that in there? That's a bad no, that's Mark's Barn. That's where it is. So you can see wiggly, wiggly river. We like wiggly rivers because that's nice and slow. But here it's really straight. It's probably been straightened. It's probably been canalised in some way. Why? All sorts of reasons. Possibly agriculture. I don't know, drainage. So all we're trying to do is encourage the river. This side, you can see woodland, not much happening. How can we try and connect that bit with the floodplain around it? It kind of, not really rocket science, is it? And also planting trees. Now, floodplain planting is something that I'm a bit of, and the idea really is that if we can get trees into the floodplain, when flood flows go through that floodplain, all we're doing is just increasing surface roughness. And it doesn't take a genius to work out that if you've got a smooth field with no trees, the water will run faster than if you've got a rough field with lots of trees. And so there are certain areas on the River Parrett, that's the River Parrett there, this is in the Bower Hinton area. We're able to, we actually did this before the big floods in 2013-14, this is quite decent sized woodland there. But our challenge was always having enough people who were prepared to do this, because floodplains tend to be long and thin. So one person might say, I'll do that bit. I've only got a little bit of the flood, but I want to do that bit, and that bit, and that bit, and join it all up, and have a great big rough area. Don't often get that luxury where everyone wants to work together. And so I just want to kind of draw to a close with this. I was talking to someone who's in the Wellams Brook catchment, in the Martock area. Who is that? Put your hand up. Who's Martock? Over Stratton. No, who was I talking to who's Martock? Yes, right.
Well, South Petherton.
South Petherton. Yeah. Oh, well that's not, okay. Okay, all right. Well, sorry, South Petherton isn't Martock. But this is the Wellams Brook catchment. And where's Wellams Brook? There's the Wellams Brook, there's Martock, these are the villages, Stokes of Hamden, Naughts of Hamden, Montacute, Odcombe, all drain through. There's the 303, and that's the road to Yeovil. And so what we did, working with the local flood wardens there, we did all sorts of different interventions. This is a few years ago now. And what we found is, this is quite a small catchment, 25 square kilometres, bearing in mind the levels as a whole is something like 100 times that. And we found by doing all these different interventions, we could make a real difference within that catchment. Now, our challenge partly is that we've got Yeovil that's growing all the time at the top end of this, pushing more water down the system than we can cope with. But we modelled it a bit, and that's what we found. So, all the interventions we put in place, we weren't measuring them like Chris's water measuring citizen science. We weren't doing that. We were taking all the interventions we'd done so far on 3 or 4 farms, and we were saying, put those into a computer and what difference that will make with different rainfall events. Now, you're able to work this out. I can't either. But what it means, if I look at it very closely, the dotted line means no natural flood management. Okay, so we've got 25 years, 2-year events, which is a rainfall storm, 5-year events, 30-year events, 100-year events. So 100-year events, that's really, really bad, where Ilminster gets flooded, all right? 2-year is just a bit of a wet winter, right? So what we're finding, no NFM is dotted lines. NFM is the solid line. So here we go, different levels of event. That's 100 year. At 100 year, you'd expect the hydrograph to be steeper, right? More rain, more flow happening in a shorter space of time because it's an awful lot of rain in one time. What we found, RNFM, can you see, RNFM is buying time. Can you see how it's pushing, it's flattening off the flood hydrograph. And this is just through, that's just through a series of woody dams. That's through a great big leaky pond that we put in. You can see with the leaky pond, what we've not just done, we've not just flattened off the hydrograph, we've shifted the timeline. Can you see? That is, from there to there is 2 hours. So we just wanted to know that if we do these things, will it make a difference? We modelled it, it does. The bigger the catchment, the more you have to do to make the difference. That's all we know. Okay, so we finished off and I came up with this catchy saying is that every farm, every field, every stream has a part to play. Okay, I think that's my time up. All right.